God bless everyone. My name is Janice Crespo. I am here with the Soul of Worship Ministries in week 17 of our So Much Better series, which is a deep study on the superiority of Jesus Christ through the Epistle to the Hebrews. So, what did we learn last time? We learned that faith is a lifelong journey. We learned that from Abraham. We learned through Rebecca that we can't maneuver God's perfect plan for us. We learned through Isaac that God honors our faith even when we fail him. And we learned through Joseph that faith believes God for the future. So we are in part 4 of Hebrews 11, and this is called the faith of Moses. So let's begin. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. So here we see that Moses is the next example of the truth that salvation comes not by works, not by religiosity or laws, by ceremony or by ritual, but it comes by faith. See, previously, Abel showed us how to live by faith. Enoch then showed us how to walk by faith. And Noah showed us how to work by faith. Abraham showed us the journey of faith. We saw that when God called Abraham out of his hometown, right? The place he grew up in. He called him out of his where his family was. He called him out of his tradition. He called him out of his religion. Because God knew that to grow Abraham's faith, it wasn't going to happen there. He had to call him out from everything he thought he knew. He had to pull him out and he had to unlearn some things in order for his faith to grow. And he knew that where he was, it wasn't going to happen. So he had to call him out from there in order to take him on a faith journey, to take him from level to level, from glory to glory in faith. We see that every time Abraham encountered God, God had to call him out. When he called him out the second time, he called him out of his complacency, right? So he continues to call him. When God calls us, he's calling us out of where he knows that we can't be, because that's not where our faith is going to grow. That's not where we're going to learn. That's not where we're going to draw closer to God. So God calls you out to draw closer to him and to move you up to the next level of where he's taking you. And the other patriarchs showed us the victory of faith in facing death with hope. For they were given the recitation, sorry, of the Abrahamic covenant, but they never saw it come to pass. Yet Abraham died in faith, and so did Isaac, and so did Jacob, and so did Joseph. So they're all models of faith in one facet or another. We also know that each of them had their own encounters with God, their own relationships with God. That's why they say the God of Abraham, the God of Jacob, the God of Isaac, right? They knew different facets of God in their own way. They were able to give God a different name depending on the encounters that they had with him. And now we look at Moses, and he shows us how faith acts in terms of the decisions that faith makes. And that's a basic way to look at life today. Life is a series of choices that we make. We either make good choices or bad choices. So we move from the book of Genesis to the book of Exodus, and we're introduced to Moses. If you don't know, Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. God used him in so many different ways. And he actually got the Ten Commandments. So it's referred to as the Mosaic Law or the Law of Moses. But let's remember who the Epistle of Hebrews is actually being written to. It was to the Israelites. It was to the Jews of that time. It was to those who believed and knew the law. See, but the letter was not about the law. It was imploring them to step out of legalism and walk in faith. So it's important to make mention of Moses in Hebrews 11 because Moses was the ultimate legalist. So it's a stunning thing to say that Moses operated in the spiritual realm, not by law, but by faith. So once again, the writer is letting them know faith is the basis for everything. And we learned that from everyone who came before us. So first, this text starts with the faith of Amram and Jochebed's faith. So you may not know who these people are, but they're actually Moses' parents. So it starts with their faith. Their faith was the foundation for Moses' life. Their faith is what started Moses' in the trajectory of Moses' life and Moses' foundation. The Bible actually tells us if you train up a child, right, in the ways of God, they will never leave them. And Moses is an example of this. If we read Exodus 1:7, it says, but the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were in dread of the children of Israel. So they were in Egypt, they were captive, right? But they actually feared them, their own slaves, because they just kept multiplying and being fruitful. But by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months. They actually weren't afraid of the Pharaoh's command in Exodus 1:22 that says, so Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So they were trying to get rid of the Hebrew children. Not the Hebrew children, the Israelite children. They were trying to kill them off so they wouldn't continue to multiply. But when we read Exodus 2, we go back to where it began, right? What actually happened? How was his parents' faith exercised here? So Exodus 2 reads, so the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to the Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew woman, that she may nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. So we notice she made an ark, just like the one that Noah built, using the same instructions, right? She daubed it with asphalt and pitch, just like Noah did. And we see that, unlike popular belief, she didn't send the basket rolling down the river, right? She placed him in the reeds where she knew an Egyptian woman would pass. And then she left Miriam there to hop in and rescue him if it was necessary, if everything went wrong. See, she used strategy. She used wisdom and faith to secure her son's life. By faith, she was able to not to put him in Pharaoh's daughter's trajectory, right? She put him in her way where she took him in, but she was still able to raise him. That's how Moses knew Hebrew. That's how Moses knew about God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. She was able to still teach him until of age where she sent him back to the palace to the daughter. This was an incredible strategy that took a lot of faith on his mother's behalf. We also see text in Hebrews 11, it says, when Moses became of age. So this refers to growth to a seasoned man. He was a prince of Egypt for 40 years. He was deep in Egyptian culture. He was educated and wealthy. Acts 7:22 tells us this. He knew hieroglyphics from the Egyptians and Hebrew from his mother. This refusal to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter was an attitude and an act of faith of Moses. All the influence of Egyptian culture could not move him from the will of God. At age 40, he made a crucial decision to do the will of God and reject the sin in Egypt. Moses made a deliberate decision to suffer with the people of God. Choosing the Israelites over the palace was no impulsive decision. Moses rejected wealth, political power, and this was one of the greatest empires on earth at the time when he lived. Egypt was the wealthiest nation in the world at this time. He had every material need anyone could ask. He had culture, fame, and wealth, but none of it influenced him. He made a clear, unequivocal decision to follow the Lord no matter what might come. God had a great plan for him and for the nation of Israel. The choice of Moses in verse 25 to suffer affliction with the people of God came from how he esteemed eternal values, values he could have only learned from his parents. His motivation was that the reproach of the Messiah was greater riches than could be found in all of Egypt. See, like the prior patriarchs, he was able to see past the cross. He was able to see the other side where the Messiah was coming. See, the word esteeming means to reckon or to calculate. Moses weighed his options carefully, whether he would continue in the Egyptian palace or suffer pain with the Hebrew people. The options were treasures or pain. But by faith, Moses weighed the inexpressible worth of Christ and the inestimable value of heaven's reward against all that Egypt had to offer. And he found the scales eternally tipped in favor of suffering for Christ in the present to receive that which awaited him in the future. He had heavenly sight. He looked past his momentary surroundings. It didn't matter the riches or the affliction. This life is temporary. He was looking at his eternal hope in Christ. But how did this all come about? There had to be an encounter, right? Moses had to have encountered God to get a better understanding, to get directions, to figure out what his purpose was, right? Not just to suffer, but we know that the Exodus is about the great Exodus. So let's read how Moses encounters God in Exodus 2. Sorry, Exodus 3, not 2. Exodus 3, starting in verse 2, we read, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, "Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover," he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, "I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good land and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" So he said, "I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." Then Moses said to God, "Indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they say to me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" And God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, 'I am has sent me to you.'" Moreover, God said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, 'The Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you.' This is my name forever, and this is my memorial to all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, 'The Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, appeared to me, saying, I have surely visited you and seen what is done to you in Egypt.'" So notice the similarities between Moses' encounter and Abraham's encounter with God that we learned about last week, right? God called his name twice. And we learned that when God calls your name twice, it's because he's bringing you out to bring you to the next level. He's getting ready to elevate you. So he calls your name twice. Moses also answered Hineni, which is a pure, astonished, unguarded affirmation given before all the facts are known. It is a spontaneous, unequivocal commitment promising, "I am here, where and as you found me, fully attentive, focused, all in." And even more, "I am here, all of me, with all that I am and all that I can be." It is a full surrender. When you hear the Lord calling you, each of them fully surrendered to him without knowing what direction he was going to give them, without knowing what he was about to say to them. None of it mattered. They completely surrendered all who they were in response to hearing God call them. But let's look what happened at the burning bush. See, the angel of the Lord appeared in the flame of fire. And Moses then turns, right? And the Hebrew word here is sir, right? For turn. It means to depart from. So what we're actually seeing here is when we see God moving, right? And we become curious. So now we turn towards God. And what happens when we turn towards God, right? First, we have to take that first step and turn towards God. And then God called him twice, meaning another level of faith, right? Moses then answered him in surrender and says, Hineni. Then God tells him, remove your sandals, initially telling him, strip away what keeps you from being vulnerable with me. Take that off. Take it away so I can be skin to skin with you. I can be here. You can be unequivocally surrendered and completely vulnerable, letting me in so you can know me and I can know you intimately. He then reminds Moses that he is the God of covenant, the same God of his ancestors from 400 years ago. And what does Moses do? Moses says, who am I? In verse 11, right? Moses sought his identity from God, just as we have to today. And God then assured him that he is not alone. He had to continue to repeat himself, I am with you, right? In verse 14, God tells him, I am who I am, which is Eya Aser Eye. In Greek, this means I will be there, howsoever I will be there. So he was reaffirming what he said in verse 12. I am with you always. Not only am I with you always, I will be there however you will need me to be there. So if you need me to be Jehovah Jireh, right, your provider, that's how I will be. If you need me to be Jehovah Rapha, your healer, that's who I will be. If you need me to be Jehovah Shalom, your peace, I will be that. Every facet of how you learn who I am, I will be for you. He was confirming he is all those things. He is all omniscient, omnipresent God. He is a sovereign God. He is everything we need. There is no facet of God that we don't need. See, there is no equivalent for God but God. If you place God on the other side of your symbol of equation, the equal sign, right? There is nothing to put on the other side but himself. See, the closest we come to equivalent is to say God is love, right? We learned that, we see that in 1 John 4:8 and 4:16. Yet, it's not an equivalent because you can't turn it around and say love is God. God is love, but he is also greater than love. Then we see that God gives Moses a command, not a suggestion. Lead the leaders. Go to the elders. You need leadership. You need help to gather 3 million people. But he needed the elders who were the covenant carriers, right? They were the ones that were around to carry the continued promise from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. See, he needed people to hold him accountable. He was about to set out on a deliverance ministry. He was about to set out on his ministry and his calling. But he wasn't going to do it alone. God was with him, but God also directed him. You need a covering. You need people who are going to pray for you. You need people who are going to hold you accountable. You need wise counsel. You need elders. You need people on earth that are going to help you to carry out the mission that I am giving you. See, Moses had to go through all these things just as we do today. This walk of faith starts when we encounter God. So again, God reminds Moses, it is he who will bring about the deliverance of Israel. Moses would be his instrument, his vessel of honor, sanctified and useful for every good work, right? We learned that in 2 Timothy 2:21. But one would think this truth should have taken the pressure off Moses. He also reminds him that he is a God who keeps promises. I have said, as in, I told this to your ancestors. I'm just repeating the same thing. I am not a God that changes. I am the same yesterday, today, and forever. The same God of covenant that spoke to Abraham. And it was because of this encounter, he was able to go forth and deliver his people from Egypt. So like Abraham, He got a word to carry him through to the next encounter. See, this was just the starting point. God didn't give him the whole picture. God gave him a word. He said, go. And Moses went. Unlike Abraham, Moses did have some questions, but God had some answers for him. So we move on to verse 27. By faith, he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. So, what is the Passover? The Passover came about when the 10th plague was sent to Egypt. So, this particular plague was different from all the previous 9 plagues that God had brought upon the Egyptians. In those plagues, no response was required by the people of Israel. But with the 10th plague, they had to respond in faith to what God had said, and they had to put their trust in Him to spare them. There had to be an action. They had to make a decision to trust God. See, what a beautiful picture this is of our own salvation by the shed blood of Jesus. The Bible says that it is appointed to all people once to die, and then comes the judgment. However, when God sees that we by faith have trusted in the shed blood of Jesus to set us free from judgment for our sin, then will be spared from judgment and will enter into the glory with Jesus in heaven. Sprinkling of blood on the doorposts of Israelites had no power in itself. However, the sprinkling was an act of faith. The Israelites accepted God's protecting grace. They knew it was God's plan. Moses instituted the Passover by faith, which became central to Israel's worship for centuries to come. They had to make the decision to follow and trust God. They had to have an action. Faith has action. Faith is a decision. We learned this from them. Verse 29 reads, by faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians, attempting to do so, were drowned. So here's a little map of the actual Exodus, right? As you can see, from point 1 to point 18, they could have went through a straight line. But instead, God took them on a journey. So God took them on a 40-year journey, not so much because He wanted to, probably not, right? Because it was their own stiff-necked, right? Their own stubbornness. God had to take them on a journey of faith. See, sometimes God allows things to happen so that He can get the glory. So had they went the straight way, they would have ended up in battle with the Philistines. And they would have probably turned around and went back, right? Like, we don't want to go into war. But the reality is that the process is to mature us and to grow us in our faith. They could have went around the Red Sea from what we see in this map, right? But instead He took them through it. So let's learn more about the actual crossing of the Red Sea in Exodus 14. And Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. And the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. But lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. And I indeed will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them. So I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, his chariots and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gained honor for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. And the angel of God, who went before the camp of Israel, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud went from before them and stood behind them. So it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. Thus it was a cloud and darkness to the one, and it gave light by night to the other, so that the one did not come near the other all that night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. Now it came to pass in the morning watch that the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and he troubled the army of the Egyptians, and he took off their chariot wheels, so that they drove them with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, Let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. Then the Lord said to Moses, Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians, on their chariots, and on their horsemen. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and when the morning appeared, the sea returned to its full depth, while the Egyptians were fleeing into it. So the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Then the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all of the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. Not so much as one of them remained. But the children of Israel had walked on dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. So we know that Moses freed the Israelites after 400 years of slavery in Egypt. They are walking through the wilderness, and God is literally with them. He is a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night to help them see and to guide them. They could have taken a shorter route, but once again, we see a faith journey. God had to take them through some things to help them grow their faith. So the Red Sea crossing, right? The Egyptians are behind them ready to attack. By faith, Moses prophesies to them that they won't see these Egyptians again. God actually tells them, stop complaining and move, right? He said, keep your peace. So why are you complaining? Basically, God is telling them, be quiet. Stop mumbling, stop grumbling, stop complaining. Just walk over, just go, start walking. And the angel and the pillar go behind them, in between them and the Egyptians. And then Moses lifts his rod and hands and parts the sea. And they walk over it on dry land. You would think this is enough, right? Just everything that they've been through was enough. The plagues, the pillar of light, the cloud by day, the fire by night, all that. You would think that was enough for these Israelites to have faith in God and know He is real. But no, God has to continue to show out. So what do we learn from the Red Sea crossing? So we learn that God's sovereignty does not exclude us from taking action. He's an all-powerful, He's all-knowing, He's fully in control. 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10 says, My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. It's easy to think that we can do nothing and let God do all the work, but we need to put our faith in action. See, we also learn that God has control over the hearts and minds of mankind. He hardened the Egyptians' hearts, right? But we also learn that there is a purpose in pain. There is a promise in the pain, and there is a plan unfolding in it. Sometimes we just got to go through some things, right? So God can show us these things. We also learned that it was before dawn, the pillar had moved behind them. right? It says during the night. It was pitch black. Have you ever been on a cruise and looked out at the sea in the middle of the night? Or at least after 9 o'clock when the sun goes down? It's a vast nothingness. It's pitch black. You can't see anything except the moonlight. But imagine these waters being separated as walls so high they probably couldn't even see the moon. They were truly walking by faith. They could see nothing. All they could do was believe that God said walk, and they had to walk. They had to believe they weren't going to walk into more water. They had to believe that they were going in the right direction. They had to believe that any shark or whale or whatever was in the water wasn't going to come out of the water at them. Everything was blindly done. But we know that God keeps his promises. This is the word he gave the patriarchs coming to pass, right? He told them, I will surely visit you and I will surely free you. We learned that God also heard the afflictions of the people. Because affliction has a sound only God can hear. They weren't crying out to God, they were just crying. And God heard them. He heard them in their pain. But here they went on dry land. Isn't it funny? It keeps stressing dry land. They crossed over on dry land, but somehow the Egyptians got stuck in it. They got muddy waters. Isn't that funny how the ground changed? Literally from one walk to the other. When the Egyptians attempted to cross the Red Sea, they drowned. They didn't have the faith of Moses. Exodus 19 tells us here, right? You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Deuteronomy 32:11 says, as an eagle stirs up its nest, hovers over its young, spreading out its wings, taking them up, carrying them on its wings. So we kind of shift here, right? Because in Exodus 19:4, he says that this whole encounter, right? This whole Exodus, he carried them on wings, as on eagle's wings. What does that mean? That he also refers to eagles again in Deuteronomy. So I did a little study on eagles, and when the eaglets are born, right? The mama eagle makes a nest. It makes it comfortable, puts leaves, feathers, right? Makes it really soft. But after a certain amount of time, when that eaglet it's time to start learning to do some things on your own, it's time to start exercising your muscles, right? They stir up the nest. What do? They take out the feathers and the leaves and everything. They make it uncomfortable. So now the little eaglets are in the nest getting thorns and getting poked by the nest itself. So what do? They have to get out of the nest. So the mama eagle puts them on their wings and soars with them, right? And the eaglet is like, woo, mommy, go, right? But what happens is when they get high enough, the eagle drops the little eaglet. And the eaglet has a choice, fall or learn to fly. What the eaglet doesn't know, right, as it's crashing towards earth, thinking it's probably going to hit the ground soon, that the mama eagle has flown before them, right? And actually swoops in and saves them before they actually come crashing onto the ground. And it does it again. It takes them all the way up and drops them again until they finally start to learn to fly on their own. So isn't it interesting, right? They were in Egypt. God had to make them uncomfortable to get them out of there, right? Once they got out of there, God took them on a journey. God gave them so many miracles, right? But he had to drop them a few times and leave them on their own to say, okay, now grow your faith. It's time for you to take action. It's time for you to put your faith in motion. But before they could come crashing down and kill themselves, God swooped in again and carried them on up. Isn't it beautiful that God cares enough for us to go before us? He knows how much we can handle before we crash and burn. He goes before us and he carries us on his wings. Ah, how beautiful. So I wanted to make some mentions of some of the Hebrew words so that we can take a different look at it, right? The staff is the matah, which is a support of life, right? And the Hebrew word is baka for word divided, which is breakthrough. And his hand is yad, which is the root word of yada, to lift your hands in praise. And waters is mayim, which is the danger. So in Proverbs 27:19, it says, as in water, face reflects face. So a man's heart reveals the man. So if we look at this as this body of water was reflecting our sin, was reflecting our choices, was reflecting the things in us that needed to be removed, right? And God said, raise your staff, right? What is that? Raise what your support of life. Who is our support of life? God. So God has to arise in us, right? And we have to lift our hands in praise, right? What happens when you lift yada praise? There is actually something happening in the spirit. It's like it's an attack, in a spiritual attack. It's breaking through, right? It's shooting out. And the waters were divided. So it broke through. When God arises in us and worship is our warfare, we can break through the things that are afflicting us. See, when we take a different look at this, we each have a Red Sea that we need to break through. We each have afflictions that we need to get through, and we can only do that by letting God arise in our lives and by worshiping, because worship truly is our warfare. And even though the waters can be a danger, we can still walk through it on dry land. Ah. So we all have to turn to God and let ourselves be led on this faith journey. We have to be willing to experience the exodus in our own lives, to let God take us from captivity to freedom, from Egypt to Canaan, not fully knowing how to cross the huge desert between the two, and not even seeing what lies ahead. Moses takes the risk of faith. All that God has given him is a promise, and yet he acted on that promise just like Abraham. So whether we are there in our desert, right, by assignment or by appointment, or if he's allowed us to go there, he's in the midst of it with us. Therefore, he's changing us in the midst of it. And as long as God is on my side, regardless of how bad it is, it gets better. Better is coming. So I found this quote by Stephen Charnock, and it says, in regard of God, patience is a submission to his sovereignty. To endure a trial simply because we cannot avoid or resist it is not Christian patience. But to humbly submit because it is the will of God to inflict the trial, to be silent because the sovereignty of God orders it, is true godly patience. See, if we don't understand this, our faith will crumble. They had to endure trials for God to grow in them, because the process is just as important as the promise. So remember, when we go through a trial, we can't avoid it, we can't resist it. We have to go through it, but let's go through it and break through it with God, knowing that God is with us. He will never leave us nor forsake us. So next week, we will continue on Hebrews 11 with the next group of verses that is called By Faith They Overcame. So some of our key takeaways for today is the importance of believing parents. Remember Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. We also learned that our reward from God is vastly superior to all that the world has to offer. We learn to wait for God's timing and move in on God's direction. And faith believes God for the breakthrough. So I hope you were blessed by this teaching, and I will see you again next week for part 4 of our continued studies. God bless you.